The world doesn't reveal a person's character when everything is going right. It reveals it in the single moment when everyone else decides to look away. The lunch rush had reached its familiar rhythm inside Hawthorne House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm chandeliers and conversations about mergers, investments, and million-dollar contracts floated through the polished dining room like carefully rehearsed performances. Servers moved with practiced precision, balancing heavy trays while managers scanned every table, making sure no wealthy guest waited more than a few seconds for attention. Every smile had a purpose. Every movement had a price. Emily Carter tightened the black apron around her waist and tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear before lifting 2 steaming bowls of lobster bisque onto her serving tray. At 27, she had mastered the quiet art of disappearing into the background. Guests rarely remembered her face. They remembered that their coffee never grew cold, their water glasses never stayed empty, and their meals always arrived with calm professionalism. For Emily, that was enough. Honest work deserved honest pride. She smiled softly as she passed an elderly couple celebrating what appeared to be their 50th anniversary, noticing the husband quietly cutting his wife's steak before she even reached for her knife. Small acts of kindness always caught her attention. They reminded her that dignity often lived in moments no one applauded. Near the entrance, a silver-haired woman stepped cautiously across the marble floor, dressed in a simple navy coat that looked elegant without demanding attention. She carried no designer handbag, wore no oversized jewelry, and walked without the entourage usually surrounding Manhattan's elite. Most guests barely noticed her. Those who did assumed she was simply another grandmother meeting family for lunch. The hostess smiled politely before turning her attention toward a famous television personality who had just entered the restaurant, leaving the older woman standing alone for a brief moment. Emily noticed the hesitation in the woman's steps but continued toward table 12, careful not to spill a single drop of soup. At the same time, a black SUV stopped outside the restaurant. Ethan Brooks stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal suit as his driver quietly closed the door behind him. At 39, the Billionaire CEO had become one of the youngest names ever listed among America's wealthiest business leaders. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Competitors called him relentless. Employees respected him, although very few believed they truly knew him. Success had taught Ethan one lesson above all others. Everyone wanted something. Some wanted money. Others wanted influence. Many simply wanted to be seen standing next to power. Genuine kindness, in his experience, usually arrived with invisible conditions attached. As he checked the time on his Swiss watch, his assistant's final text appeared across the screen. "Your mother arrived 5 minutes early. Table reserved." Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket and walked toward the entrance, unaware that everything he believed about people was about to be quietly challenged. Inside the restaurant, the older woman took another careful step. The polished marble reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through the towering windows. One heel caught the edge of a decorative rug. Time seemed to hesitate. Her balance shifted. The leather handbag slipped from her shoulder. She reached instinctively for something that wasn't there. Then she fell gently onto one knee before settling awkwardly onto the polished floor. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Conversations paused for less than a heartbeat before continuing. Several guests looked over, then quickly returned to their meals. A server carrying champagne froze, glanced toward the manager, then kept walking. The hostess looked uncomfortable but remained behind her podium. The restaurant manager frowned, calculating delays, customer complaints, and liability before compassion. Emily had just placed the bowls of soup onto table 12 when she heard the soft gasp echo across the dining room. Without thinking, she set her tray onto the nearest service station. Without asking permission, without checking who might be watching, without wondering whether helping would cost her precious minutes during the busiest hour of the day. She simply ran toward the woman while dozens of expensive watches continued ticking in perfect silence. And from the doorway, Ethan Brooks stopped walking as the only person in the entire restaurant knelt beside his mother. Emily lowered herself onto the polished marble without the slightest hesitation, one knee touching the cool floor beside the older woman as though nothing else inside the elegant restaurant existed. Her voice remained calm and gentle, carrying none of the panic that often spreads faster than accidents themselves. "Ma'am, do not rush. Take a slow breath. Are you feeling dizzy?" The silver-haired woman looked up, surprised more by the warmth in the young waitress's eyes than by the unexpected fall. "I believe I lost my balance," she answered quietly, offering an embarrassed smile. "I am afraid I caused quite a scene." Emily shook her head almost imperceptibly. "No, you did not. You simply need a moment." She carefully picked up the woman's handbag before retrieving a pair of reading glasses that had slipped only a few inches away. She brushed away a tiny trace of dust from the frame with the corner of her apron before placing them gently into the woman's hand. "Here you go." Around them, conversations slowly resumed, but not without curious glances. Some guests watched with mild interest before returning to discussions about quarterly earnings and vacation homes. Others seemed relieved that someone else had stepped forward, allowing them to continue pretending nothing unusual had happened. The restaurant manager finally approached, though his attention seemed divided between the fallen guest and the growing line of customers waiting near the entrance. "Emily," he said under his breath, forcing a polite smile for nearby diners. "The lunch service is backing up." Emily looked up only briefly. She may have twisted her ankle. "I want to make sure she can stand safely." His jaw tightened. "Another server can handle that." Emily answered softly but firmly. "There is not another server here." The words were respectful. They carried no challenge, only simple truth. The manager hesitated, clearly unhappy that one of his waitresses had decided compassion deserved priority over efficiency. Before he could insist again, the older woman reached for Emily's hand. "Would you help me up?" she asked. "Of course." Emily positioned herself carefully, making sure the woman did not place too much weight on one side, before helping her rise slowly to her feet. "Take your time. There is no hurry." Once standing, the woman tested her footing. She smiled with quiet relief. "I think I am all right." Emily noticed a slight tremble in her hand. "Would you mind sitting for a few minutes before walking any farther?" "That is probably wise." Emily guided her toward a nearby chair instead of the reserved dining table, knowing it offered better support. She disappeared for less than 30 seconds before returning with a glass of cool water and a clean linen napkin. "Drink slowly," she said. "Sometimes people feel a little shaken even if they are not seriously hurt." The woman accepted both with grateful eyes. "You sound as though you have done this before." Emily smiled modestly. "My father has arthritis. Some days his balance is not what it used to be. I learned that rushing only makes people more nervous." The older woman's expression softened. "You take care of him?" "Every day before work and every evening after my shift." "That cannot leave much time for yourself." Emily gave a quiet laugh. "Life has seasons. Right now this is mine." Those words lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. Standing just inside the entrance, Ethan Brooks had not interrupted. He had witnessed every second without revealing who he was. His eyes moved from Emily's steady hands to the relaxed expression returning to his mother's face. He noticed details other people overlooked. Emily never glanced toward the dining room to see who was watching. She never looked at the woman's coat searching for designer labels. She never asked for a last name or mentioned compensation. She simply behaved as though helping another human being required no explanation. Ethan had spent nearly 2 decades surrounded by polished smiles that often disappeared the moment influence was no longer useful. Investors complimented him before asking for favors. Strangers recognized him before introducing themselves. Even charitable events frequently carried invisible transactions beneath their generosity. Yet this young waitress had offered something he rarely encountered anymore. Time, attention, patience. None of it appeared rehearsed. None of it seemed calculated. Emily adjusted the older woman's chair slightly closer to the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. "Does that feel better?" she asked. "Much better," the woman replied with a grateful smile. "What is your name?" "Emily Carter." The older woman repeated it softly, committing it to memory. "Emily, kindness has become surprisingly rare." Emily looked almost puzzled by the comment. "I do not think kindness disappears," she answered. "Sometimes people are simply too busy to notice someone needs it." From only a few feet away, Ethan remained perfectly still, realizing that for the first time in many years, someone had just said something that no boardroom, no financial report, and no billion-dollar negotiation had ever managed to teach him. Emily gave the older woman one last reassuring smile before returning to the rhythm of the lunch rush as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She collected the abandoned serving tray, apologized to the guests at table 12 for the brief delay, and resumed taking orders with the same quiet professionalism that had defined every shift she had ever worked. There was no expectation of praise, no glance toward the entrance, no curiosity about whether anyone had been watching. In Emily's mind, the moment had already passed. Someone had needed help. She had helped. Life moved forward. Eleanor Brooks, however, found it impossible to stop watching the young waitress. She accepted another careful sip of water while following Emily with thoughtful eyes as the young woman crossed the dining room, carrying fresh coffee, offering warm smiles to every guest regardless of how politely or impatiently they treated her. There was something remarkably steady about her. She did not rush even when the restaurant demanded speed. She did not appear flustered by difficult customers. She simply carried herself with a calm confidence that seemed untouched by the frantic pace surrounding her. Ethan finally approached his mother, his polished dress shoes making almost no sound across the marble floor. Eleanor looked up and smiled. "You are late," she said gently. Ethan returned the smile, though his eyes briefly drifted toward Emily before settling back on his mother. "Only by a few minutes. You saw everything." It was not a question. Ethan nodded once. "I did." Eleanor folded the linen napkin neatly across her lap. "She never asked who I was. I noticed. Most people recognize our name before they recognize us." Ethan pulled out the chair across from her. "That has been true for a long time." His mother studied his expression carefully. She knew her son well enough to recognize the rare moments when something genuinely unsettled his carefully ordered thinking. "You were wondering whether she knew." Ethan glanced once more toward Emily, who was patiently explaining a menu recommendation to another table while laughing softly at something an elderly customer had said. "If she knew, she is an extraordinary actress." Eleanor smiled knowingly. Or perhaps she simply does not measure people that way. Those words settled into the silence between them. Ethan had built an empire by studying motives. Every negotiation, every acquisition, every partnership depended on understanding what people truly wanted. Behind every smile there was usually an objective. Behind every favor there was often an expectation. That belief had rarely failed him in business. Yet the waitress who had knelt beside his mother had displayed none of the familiar signals he had learned to anticipate. She had not lingered after helping. She had not introduced herself beyond answering a direct question. She had not searched the room for recognition. She had simply returned to work. A young executive from a nearby table suddenly recognized Ethan and hurried over with an eager smile. "Mr. Brooks, what a surprise. I did not know you would be here today." Ethan rose, politely, shook the man's hand, and exchanged a few brief words about an upcoming conference before the executive asked whether he might schedule a meeting sometime the following week. Ethan agreed courteously. As the man walked away, Eleanor raised an amused eyebrow. "There it is again." Ethan smiled faintly. "What?" "Everyone wants something." Ethan looked down at the untouched menu in front of him. "Usually." Eleanor reached for his hand, something she had done since he was a little boy struggling to understand a world that often valued success more than sincerity. That young woman wanted nothing except to make sure an old lady could stand without feeling embarrassed. Ethan remained silent. Across the dining room, Emily noticed an elderly gentleman struggling to read the dessert menu beneath the dim afternoon lighting. Without being asked, she quietly moved a small table lamp a few inches closer before continuing toward the kitchen. The gentleman smiled with grateful surprise. She never waited for thanks. She simply noticed. Ethan watched that small interaction with growing curiosity. It was even smaller than what she had done for his mother, yet somehow just as revealing. Some people performed kindness when the room was watching. Emily appeared to practice it when no one was paying attention at all. Just then, the restaurant manager emerged from the office, his expression noticeably strained. He glanced toward Emily, then toward Ethan, unaware that the billionaire had witnessed everything since arriving. The manager adjusted his tie, straightened his jacket, and began walking directly toward the young waitress with the determined expression of someone preparing to address a problem. Emily looked up as she finished placing fresh bread on a nearby table, completely unaware that the next conversation would quietly change the course of her ordinary afternoon. The restaurant manager stopped only a few feet from Emily, forcing a courteous smile that disappeared the instant his back was turned toward the dining room. He lowered his voice just enough to avoid attracting attention. "Emily, I need to speak with you." She placed the bread basket gently onto the table she had just served and nodded. "Of course." They stepped beside a polished wooden partition near the service station where the sounds of clinking silverware softened their conversation. The manager folded his arms. "You abandoned your section during the busiest lunch hour of the week." Emily answered calmly. "A guest had fallen. You should have alerted someone else." There was no one else helping her. His expression tightened. "That was not your responsibility." Emily met his eyes with quiet respect. She was on the floor. At that moment, I believed she was. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The manager was not an unkind man by nature, but years spent protecting the restaurant's reputation had taught him to think first about efficiency, schedules, and customer satisfaction reports. Delays meant complaints. Complaints meant lost business. Lost business meant difficult conversations with the owners. Compassion rarely appeared on performance evaluations. Several tables waited longer than expected, he continued. One customer already mentioned slow service. Emily nodded without offering excuses. "I understand. You are one of my most dependable servers, but you cannot decide which rules apply to you." She accepted the criticism without resentment. "I was not trying to ignore the rules." "Then what were you trying to do?" Emily looked briefly across the dining room where the older woman now sat comfortably speaking with the gentleman who had recently joined her. "I was trying to make sure someone did not feel alone." The answer arrived so naturally that it caught the manager completely off guard. Before he could respond, another server hurried over carrying a tray of iced tea. "Table 6 needs extra lemons," she whispered before rushing away again. The manager sighed quietly. "Return to your section. We will discuss this after your shift." "Yes, sir." Emily offered the same polite smile she gave every customer before walking back onto the dining floor. There was no frustration on her face. No disappointment. She simply continued working, greeting a family with 2 young children, kneeling beside the little boy to ask whether he preferred apple juice or milk before standing again with effortless grace. Eleanor watched everything with growing admiration. She accepted criticism she did not deserve, she said softly. Ethan remained silent for a moment. Most people would have defended themselves. Perhaps she does not believe every disagreement requires a battle. Ethan considered those words carefully. During countless board meetings, he had watched executives interrupt one another, protect their reputations, and fight over decisions that ultimately mattered far less than they claimed. Emily had just demonstrated an entirely different kind of confidence. She had not surrendered her values. She had simply refused to let pride become louder than purpose. A few minutes later, an elderly gentleman at a nearby table accidentally dropped his fork beneath his chair. Before anyone else noticed, Emily quietly picked it up, replaced it with a clean one, and wished him a pleasant meal without drawing attention to the mistake. The gentleman smiled with visible relief. Across the room, a young mother struggled to calm a restless little girl. Emily appeared with a small cup of sliced strawberries, asking the mother's permission before offering them to the child. Within moments, the little girl smiled, and the exhausted mother whispered a heartfelt thank you. Emily simply nodded and continued walking. Ethan found himself observing not isolated gestures, but a pattern. Every few minutes, another quiet act unfolded. None of them dramatic. None designed to impress. Together, they revealed something far more meaningful than a single heroic moment. Kindness, he realized, was not something Emily occasionally chose. It appeared to be the way she had decided to live. The lunch rush slowly eased as sunlight shifted across the tall windows, filling the restaurant with a softer golden glow. Eleanor finished her tea before looking thoughtfully toward her son. "Invite her over," she said. Ethan looked surprised. "Now, not as a billionaire." She smiled gently, as the son of the woman she helped. Ethan glanced once more toward Emily, who was carefully polishing a water glass before setting it onto a newly prepared table. She looked exactly as she had an hour earlier. Calm, focused, entirely unaware that every quiet decision she had made since the beginning of her shift had been changing the opinion of the most influential man in the room. Ethan pushed his chair back and rose slowly, but before he could take his first step toward her, his phone vibrated sharply inside his jacket. He looked down at the screen, and the expression on his face changed almost instantly. Ethan looked at the notification for only a second before locking the screen again. Another urgent request from his executive team. Another acquisition waiting for his approval. Another decision worth millions of dollars. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have answered immediately. Today, for the first time in years, it could wait. He slipped the phone back into his jacket and continued watching Emily instead. His mother noticed the gesture and smiled quietly without saying a word. She understood better than anyone how unusual that simple choice truly was. Emily finished clearing a table near the windows before stopping beside an elderly veteran who struggled to button the cuff of his jacket with stiff fingers. Without making the man feel helpless, she held the fabric steady while he fastened it himself. "There you go," she said warmly. "You did all the hard work." The gentleman chuckled. "My hands have not listened to me for years." "Some days mine do not either," Emily replied with a playful smile. "Fortunately, they usually forgive me by tomorrow." The man laughed softly, his pride untouched because she had never treated him like a burden. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Emily always protected people's dignity before solving their problem. She never rushed to take over. She quietly gave them enough support to succeed on their own. It was a quality impossible to teach in corporate seminars or leadership retreats. A few moments later, she disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with a small paper bag. One of the dishwashers, a young college student preparing to leave after his morning shift, accepted it with grateful surprise. Ethan watched the young man hug the bag against his chest before quietly thanking Emily. Curious, he turned toward a nearby server who happened to be refilling water glasses. "Excuse me," Ethan said politely. The young woman immediately recognized him, her eyes widening. "Yes, Mr. Brooks." "What did she just give him?" The server smiled. "Probably lunch." Ethan looked puzzled. "Probably. Emily packs extra sandwiches almost every morning. She says college students burn through groceries faster than they can afford them." "Does the restaurant pay for that?" "No, sir." The server shook her head. "She makes them herself before work." Ethan remained silent. He had expected an explanation involving employee programs or charitable initiatives. Instead, it was simply another quiet habit. Another kindness no one had asked her to perform. The server excused herself and returned to work, leaving Ethan standing with a strange feeling he could not immediately name. Across the dining room, Eleanor had been observing her son instead of Emily. She recognized the thoughtful expression on his face. It was the same look he wore whenever he encountered a problem that refused to fit inside his usual way of thinking. When Ethan returned to the table, his mother folded her hands together. "You are trying to understand her." "Yes." "You cannot." He looked up with mild surprise. "Why not?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Because you are searching for a reason. Some people simply choose to be kind." Ethan leaned back in his chair. There is usually a story behind choices like that. Perhaps. But kindness does not always come from comfort. Sometimes it comes from remembering what it feels like to need it. Those words settled deeply inside him. Before he could answer, a sharp voice suddenly interrupted the peaceful atmosphere. "Emily." The restaurant manager stood near the service station, holding a clipboard. His expression remained controlled, but several nearby employees instinctively stopped what they were doing. Emily approached immediately. "Yes, sir. I have reassigned 3 of your tables." She nodded. "All right." Several guests complained about delayed service earlier. Emily accepted the information without protest. "I understand. When your shift ends, please come to my office." A few nearby servers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew that requests rarely led to good news. Emily simply answered, "I will be there." She turned back toward the dining room before noticing one of her regular customers waiting patiently for fresh coffee. She smiled exactly as she always had, poured the refill, and wished him a wonderful afternoon. Not once did she allow her private worry to become someone else's burden. Eleanor watched with quiet sadness. She thinks she may lose her job. Ethan followed Emily with his eyes. And she is still making everyone else feel welcome. Neither of them noticed that another customer seated near the center of the restaurant had recorded much of what happened earlier on a cell phone. The young woman quietly uploaded the short video before finishing her lunch, completely unaware that within the next few hours, thousands of strangers would begin watching a waitress kneel beside an elderly woman while an entire dining room remained standing. Ethan remained where he stood for another long moment, watching Emily move from table to table with the same quiet grace she had carried since the beginning of the afternoon. The conversation with the manager had clearly weighed on her, yet nothing in her expression suggested resentment. Every guest still received her full attention. Every smile remained genuine. Every thank you sounded exactly as sincere as the first one she had spoken that day. Finally, he turned toward his mother. Eleanor noticed the decision forming before he said a single word. "You are going to speak with her," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Not as a businessman." Eleanor smiled. "Good. She deserves to meet a person before a title." Ethan walked calmly across the dining room. Several guests recognized him immediately. Quiet whispers spread from one table to another as heads turned in his direction. A pair of investment bankers paused their discussion. A young entrepreneur sitting near the windows discreetly nudged his colleague. Even two servers exchanged surprised glances. Emily, however, remained focused on placing a fresh cup of coffee in front of an elderly woman who thanked her warmly. "Enjoy your afternoon," Emily replied before turning around and finding Ethan standing only a few feet away. She offered the same professional smile she gave every customer. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome. May I help you?" Ethan looked directly into her eyes. "Actually, I believe you already have." Emily appeared slightly confused. "I am sorry." Before Ethan could answer, Eleanor slowly approached them with measured steps. Emily immediately noticed her and smiled with genuine relief. "You are walking much better." Eleanor reached out and gently touched Emily's hand. "Because of you." Emily shook her head modestly. "You simply needed a few minutes to recover." Several nearby guests had begun watching openly now, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The restaurant manager noticed the gathering attention and hurried toward them, assuming another problem required immediate intervention. "Is everything all right, Mr. Brooks?" he asked, suddenly recognizing the distinguished guest standing beside Emily. The color drained slightly from his face as realization settled in. Brooks. Ethan Brooks. Eleanor Brooks. The woman who had fallen was not an ordinary guest after all. The manager immediately straightened his jacket. "Mrs. Brooks, I sincerely apologize for what happened earlier. If there is anything the restaurant can do to make this right, we would be honored." Eleanor answered with calm dignity. "There is something you can do." "Absolutely. Thank the young woman who treated me like a human being before anyone knew my last name." Silence spread through the dining room. The manager slowly turned toward Emily, remembering every word he had spoken to her only minutes earlier. Ethan finally broke the quiet. His voice was steady but carried naturally across the nearby tables. "When I arrived today, I saw dozens of successful people in this room." His eyes moved briefly around the restaurant before returning to Emily. "Only one person saw my mother instead of an inconvenience." More guests had stopped eating entirely. Conversations faded until the gentle music playing overhead became the loudest sound in the restaurant. Ethan continued. "My name opens many doors. My company signs billion-dollar agreements. None of that mattered when my mother was on the floor. The only thing that mattered was character." Emily lowered her eyes slightly, visibly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. "Sir, I only did what anyone should have done." Ethan smiled faintly. "That is exactly the point." The manager cleared his throat awkwardly. "Emily has always been one of our hardest workers." Ethan looked at him without anger, only quiet honesty. "Then I hope she is recognized for that." The manager swallowed before nodding quickly. "She will be." Eleanor gently squeezed Emily's hand once more. "My dear, thank you for protecting something far more important than my balance today." Emily looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's eyes glistened with warmth. "My dignity." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Several guests quietly lowered their eyes, remembering that they had watched an elderly woman fall without leaving their seats. The weight of that realization settled heavily across the elegant dining room. Then, from somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the applause spread naturally throughout the room. Emily stood completely still, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment rather than pride, while Ethan watched the unexpected scene unfold. For the first time in many years, he witnessed an entire room applauding not wealth, not power, not influence, but a simple act of human kindness. The applause lingered for several long seconds before slowly fading into a respectful silence. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her hands still folded neatly in front of her apron. She wished the attention would end. She had never helped anyone hoping to become the center of a room. "Please," she said softly, almost apologetically. "You really do not need to applaud me. I only helped someone who needed a hand." Her words carried no false modesty. They were simply true. Ethan looked around the dining room and noticed something he had not expected. Several guests who had remained seated earlier now avoided looking at Emily altogether. Others offered quiet smiles, perhaps recognizing that they had missed an opportunity to do something simple but meaningful. Eleanor turned toward her son. "This is why kindness matters," she whispered. "It reminds the rest of us who we could have been." Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He removed an elegant business card embossed with the Brooks Capital logo and held it toward Emily. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "I would like to offer you something." Emily looked at the card but made no effort to take it. "What kind of offer?" "A position at Brooks Capital." Several nearby employees gasped quietly. Even the restaurant manager stared in disbelief. Ethan continued, "Our company needs people with judgment, integrity, and compassion. Skills can be taught. Character cannot." Emily listened respectfully before answering. "That is very generous, Mr. Brooks." Ethan smiled. "Please, call me Ethan." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Thank you, Ethan, but I cannot accept." The entire dining room fell silent again. The manager blinked in confusion. One of the nearby guests nearly dropped his coffee cup. Ethan himself appeared genuinely surprised. "May I ask why?" Emily finally accepted the business card, not as acceptance, but simply out of courtesy, turning it over once before looking back at him. "Because I have responsibilities waiting for me when this shift ends." Ethan remained attentive. Emily spoke quietly enough that those closest leaned forward to hear. "My father depends on me every evening. He cannot prepare dinner alone anymore. His physical therapy appointments are early in the morning, so I take him before coming here. My schedule may not look important compared to yours, but to him it is everything." Eleanor's eyes softened immediately. Ethan listened without interrupting. Emily continued, "I also promised myself something a long time ago." "What was that?" Ethan asked. "Never make an important decision while standing in the middle of an emotional moment." Ethan could not help smiling. "That sounds surprisingly wise." Emily returned a small smile of her own. "My father taught me that after my mother passed away. He said gratitude is wonderful, but it should never replace clear thinking." Eleanor quietly brushed a tear from the corner of her eye. The restaurant manager looked down at the floor, suddenly realizing how little he actually knew about the young woman who had worked under his supervision for almost 3 years. Ethan folded his hands thoughtfully. "Then perhaps I should ask again another day." Emily nodded. "Perhaps." He tilted his head slightly. "Would you at least allow me to thank you properly?" Emily answered without hesitation. "You already have." "I do not believe I have." She looked around the dining room where guests had slowly begun smiling at strangers they had ignored only an hour earlier. People are paying attention now. Maybe the next time someone falls, they will not wait for somebody else to move first. Those words settled over the room with remarkable weight. No lecture could have delivered the lesson more gently. No speech could have sounded more sincere. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, reflecting on everything he had witnessed since walking through the restaurant doors. Billions of dollars had given him influence, opportunities, and recognition. Yet none of those things had inspired an entire room to reconsider its own behavior. One waitress had accomplished that without intending to. Eleanor slipped her arm gently through her son's. "She just gave you another lesson," she whispered with a knowing smile. Ethan laughed quietly. "She did." Emily excused herself politely. "If you will forgive me, table 8 has been waiting for their dessert." Before anyone could say another word, she turned and walked back toward her guests with the same calm, steady pace she had carried all afternoon. She did not walk away from opportunity. She walked toward responsibility. Ethan watched her disappear into the rhythm of ordinary work, holding the realization that the rarest people were often the ones least interested in proving how extraordinary they truly were. 1 week later, the memory of that extraordinary afternoon had settled into something quieter, but it had not disappeared. At Hawthorne House, the lunch crowd flowed through the restaurant as it always had. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight. Soft piano music drifted through the elegant dining room. Emily tied her black apron before beginning another shift, expecting nothing more than another ordinary day filled with coffee refills, handwritten orders, and polite conversations with strangers whose names she would probably never know. She had not heard from Ethan Brooks. She had not called the number printed on his business card. In fact, the card remained tucked safely inside the pages of a small notebook she kept beside her father's favorite recipes at home. To Emily, gratitude did not create obligation, and kindness certainly did not earn rewards. She had simply continued living the life she already loved. Around 2 o'clock, when the busiest part of lunch had finally begun to slow, the hostess approached with an unusual expression. "Emily," she whispered, "there is someone asking specifically for you." Emily looked toward the entrance and immediately recognized Eleanor Brooks standing there alone. She wore another elegant but understated outfit, this time a light blue coat with a simple pearl necklace. There were no security guards surrounding her, no photographers, no luxury gifts carried behind her. She looked less like the mother of one of the richest men in America and more like a grandmother visiting an old friend. Emily walked over with genuine surprise. "Mrs. Brooks, it is wonderful to see you again. How are you feeling?" Eleanor smiled warmly. "Much stronger, thanks to a certain young waitress." Emily laughed softly. "I think time deserves most of the credit." "Perhaps," Eleanor replied. "But time is much easier to appreciate when someone reminds you that you matter." Before Emily could answer, Eleanor reached into her handbag and removed a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. Emily accepted it carefully. "What is this?" "A letter." Emily looked slightly puzzled. "A letter?" Eleanor nodded. "Not everything important should arrive through electronic mail." Emily smiled as she gently opened the envelope. Inside rested a single sheet of thick stationery covered with elegant handwriting. She began, reading silently. "Dear Emily, there are moments in life that remind us how easily people become invisible, especially when they grow older. Last week, while I was sitting on that cold marble floor, I did not fear embarrassment nearly as much as being forgotten. Before anyone knew my name, you reminded me that dignity belongs to every person, not only those with influence or wealth. You never asked who I was because you had already decided who you were. Thank you for giving an old woman something far more valuable than assistance. You gave me peace." Emily paused, blinking slowly as emotion warmed her eyes. Eleanor continued speaking gently while Emily finished reading. "I wanted those words to come from me instead of my son. He is an excellent businessman. Sometimes he forgets that the heart speaks a different language than contracts do." Emily folded the letter carefully, treating it as though it were something fragile. "This means more than you know." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "I hoped it would." They stood together quietly for several moments before Eleanor spoke again. "I also came to ask something." Emily looked up. "Anything. Would you have dinner with us this Sunday?" Emily hesitated instinctively. "With your family?" "Yes." Eleanor reached over and gently touched Emily's arm. "Not as an employee, not as someone receiving a reward, simply as our guest." Emily searched the older woman's eyes, finding only sincerity. "I do not know what to say. You could simply say yes." Emily laughed through the tears she had been trying to hide. "Then yes, I would be honored." At that exact moment, the restaurant manager walked past carrying several reservation folders before noticing Eleanor standing beside Emily. He immediately stopped. During the past week, he had replayed his own behavior countless times. Quietly, he approached Emily. "May I interrupt for just a moment?" Emily nodded. The manager cleared his throat before speaking with complete sincerity. "I owe you an apology." Emily looked surprised. "There is no need." "There is." He took a slow breath. "I spent years believing efficiency was the highest standard in this business. You reminded me that hospitality begins long before food reaches the table. Thank you for teaching me that lesson." Emily smiled gently. "We all learn from someone." The manager returned the smile before walking away. Eleanor watched him disappear into the dining room. "You see," she said softly, "sometimes one quiet decision changes far more lives than the person making it will ever realize." Emily looked down at the handwritten letter once more, holding it close against her heart as the afternoon sunlight streamed through the restaurant windows, warming the paper in her hands almost as gently as the kindness that had first inspired every word written upon it. Sunday evening arrived wrapped in the quiet golden light of early autumn. Emily stood outside the Brooks family residence holding nothing more than a homemade apple pie, carefully covered with a clean kitchen towel the way her father had always taught her. She had almost canceled twice during the drive across Manhattan, convinced she did not belong among people whose names appeared on magazine covers and business networks. Yet Eleanor had not invited her because of status. She had invited her because of character. Emily rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the front door opened, not by a housekeeper or security officer, but by Ethan himself. He wore a simple navy sweater instead of an expensive tailored suit, and for the first time Emily saw not the billionaire recognized by the financial world, but a son welcoming a guest into his home. "I am glad you came," he said with a genuine smile. Emily lifted the pie slightly. "My father insisted nobody should arrive at dinner empty-handed." Ethan accepted it with quiet appreciation. "Then I think I already like your father's advice." Inside, the house felt surprisingly warm. Family photographs lined the hallway instead of portraits celebrating wealth. A well-used piano stood beside the living room window. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table. Nothing seemed arranged to impress anyone. Eleanor appeared from the kitchen wearing a simple apron, laughing as she embraced Emily like an old friend. Throughout dinner, they spoke about ordinary things. Emily described helping her father rebuild his small vegetable garden after a difficult winter. Eleanor shared stories about Ethan as a stubborn little boy who once tried to build a treehouse without reading the instructions. Ethan listened more than he spoke, discovering that Emily never exaggerated her experiences and never minimized anyone else's. When dinner ended, Eleanor excused herself to prepare coffee, leaving Ethan and Emily on the back terrace overlooking a quiet garden where the evening breeze stirred the maple leaves. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Ethan looked toward the fading sunset. "I spent years believing success meant learning how to read people," he said quietly. "Then you reminded me that sometimes the people worth knowing are the ones who never try to be noticed." Emily smiled gently. "My father says the strongest trees are usually the quietest ones in the forest." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I would still like to offer you an opportunity." Emily looked at him with calm curiosity. "I remember. This time it is different." He handed her a simple folder. "Brooks Foundation is creating a hospitality scholarship for students who work while caring for family members. It will provide tuition assistance, mentorship, and emergency support. I would like you to help us shape it. Not because you have a business degree, because you understand the people it is meant to serve." Emily opened the folder slowly. There was no employment contract, no salary proposal, only a mission statement with blank pages waiting to be filled. She looked up. "You want me to help decide how people are treated?" "Exactly." Ethan smiled. "I have enough executives. What I need are people who remember what dignity feels like." Emily closed the folder carefully. "Then I will gladly help." Months passed. The scholarship quietly changed lives across New York. Students who once believed higher education had become impossible found new opportunities. Restaurant workers caring for aging parents received support they never expected. None of the announcements featured Emily's photograph. She preferred it that way. One afternoon, she returned to Hawthorne House for lunch on her day off. The manager greeted her with genuine warmth. Several former co-workers embraced her before returning to their tables. Near the entrance, an elderly gentleman paused uncertainly with his cane as the busy dining room moved around him. Before anyone else could react, two young servers stepped forward together, smiling as they offered him a steady arm. Emily watched without saying a word. Eleanor, who happened to be joining her for lunch that day, noticed the quiet smile spreading across Emily's face. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Emily looked toward the young servers helping the gentleman reach his table. "Nothing changed because I helped one person," she answered softly. "Everything changed because someone else decided to help the next one." Eleanor reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the restaurant windows exactly as it had on the day their paths first crossed. Inside, kindness no longer waited for permission. It simply moved first. And perhaps that is how the world changes. Not through the loudest voices or the greatest fortunes, but through ordinary people who quietly refuse to let another human being stand alone.